"You deserve better," I told her. "Then be better," she said right before the richest man in the valley decided to bury us both. Single lamp on his table threw a pool of gold onto the worn pine, illuminating the scoured surface where he ate his meals alone. Outside, the wind was rising, a low moan that promised a storm by morning. He had checked the livestock, latched the barn, and stacked the wood high beside the hearth. Everything was in its place, a fortress of solitude built with calloused hands. He sat cleaning his rifle, the oiled steel cool beneath his fingers, the rhythmic slide of the cloth a familiar comfort in the growing silence of the house. The world outside could howl. Within these log walls there was order. There was quiet. It was a life he had not so much chosen as accepted, a silent pact made with the land. He was a part of it, as solitary as a hawk circling a pale sky. The lamplight flickered, catching on the rim of a single tin cup. He did not own another. There had never been a reason to. The wind-driven sleet began to rattle against the window pane like a handful of thrown gravel, and a sound thin and sharp cut through the noise. It was not the wind. It was the splintering of wood, followed by a cry so faint it was nearly stolen by the gale. Silas stilled, his head lifting. The oiled cloth fell from his hand. He was no longer alone in the storm. He found her beside the wreckage of a light wagon, one wheel shattered against a half-buried rock on the track to his homestead. The horse stood trembling, its coat already dusted with ice. The woman was on her feet, but barely, one hand pressed to the broken wheel, the other clutching a thin shawl against a wind that tore at it with greedy fingers. She did not look like she belonged to this country. Her dress was worn, but well made for a town, not the frontier, and her face, pale in the dying light, was set with a pride that fought the exhaustion, threatening to buckle her knees. He reined in his own mount, the big gelding steady against the gusts. He didn't speak, merely watched as she finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his without fear, only a stark, bone-deep weariness. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. "Storm's turning to a blizzard," he said. The words were rough, pulled from a throat unused to speaking to anyone but his horse. He didn't offer help. He stated a fact. The sky was iron gray, the world shrinking into a vortex of wind and biting ice. She watched him, her chin lifted. "I can see that." Her voice was clear but strained. He gave a short, sharp nod and turned his attention to her horse, his hands moving with gentle confidence to unhitch the traces. She didn't protest, didn't argue. Survival was a language that required few words. He freed the animal and tied its lead to his saddle horn. Then he looked back at her, his gaze taking in the inadequate shoes, the shivering frame. He walked to the wagon and pulled a heavy wool blanket from his own bedroll, the one he kept for emergencies. He held it out to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes searching his face in the gloom. He saw the flicker of mistrust, the deep-seated caution of a person who had learned that every offered hand came with a price. He simply held the blanket, his arm steady, his expression unreadable. Finally, she took it, her cold fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through the frozen air between them. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and he gestured toward his horse. "You'll ride." It was not a request. He helped her mount, his hands carefully impersonal at her waist, lifting her with an ease that spoke of immense strength held in careful reserve. He swung up behind her, the space between them charged with the alien presence of another human being. He did not touch her again. He just gathered the reins, turned the horses away from the broken wagon, and rode into the heart of the storm. A stranger settled against his chest, the scent of rain and something softer, like crushed lavender, filling the cold air around him. The cabin was small, one room that served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom. A stone hearth dominated one wall, A bed was tucked into the opposite corner, and a sturdy table stood in the center. It was meticulously clean, a space of Spartan order. He helped her down from the horse, his touch as brief as before, and led her inside. The warmth from the fire he'd banked was a physical blow, and she swayed on her feet. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then released her as soon as she was stable. He named himself while pulling off his stiff, frozen gloves. Silas. She unwrapped the blanket, her movements slow, and folded it with a neatness that seemed instinctual. Elara. He nodded, accepting the name as he accepted her presence. A fact delivered by the storm, to be dealt with practically. He took the wet blanket and hung it near the fire, then gestured to the single chair at the table. Sit. I'll see to the horses. He left without another word, leaving her alone in the quiet warmth. Elara sank into the chair, the heat from the hearth seeping into her bones. She looked around the small room. There was nothing soft in it, nothing superfluous. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, a sparse collection of books sat on a rough-hewn shelf, and a single tin plate and cup were set on a drying rack by the water basin. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and no one. When Silas returned, stamping the last of the ice from his boots, he brought with him the clean, sharp scent of the cold. He didn't look at her as he moved to the stove, adding wood and stoking the flames. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and sliced thick pieces of bread from a loaf, setting them on the table with a wedge of cheese and a jar of preserves. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind that rattled the cabin's single window. It was not an awkward silence. It was a shared quiet, a mutual acknowledgment of the storm outside and the sanctuary within. He watched her from beneath the brim of his hat, which he had not removed. He saw the way her hands, though chapped and cold, moved with a delicate grace as she ate. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the guarded set of her jaw. She was a survivor. It was written in the lines around her eyes. After they finished, he cleared the table, washing the 2 plates and cups with an efficient lack of fuss. When he was done, he turned to her. You can take the bed. She looked from him to the narrow cot, piled with thick furs. Where will you sleep? Floor's fine. His tone left no room for argument. She did not thank him. Instead, she met his gaze directly, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. I have a small knife in my reticule. He nodded once. You should keep it handy. It was an acknowledgment of her fear, of her right to it. It was, in its own way, the most comforting thing he could have said. He laid a bedroll for himself on the floor near the hearth, far from her, giving her as much space as the small cabin would allow. He checked the latch on the door, banked the fire for the night, and turned down the lamp until the room was cast in deep shadows and the soft, flickering glow from the embers. Lying on the hard floor, Silas stared into the darkness, listening. He heard the rustle of cloth as she settled into his bed, the soft sigh as her body finally gave in to exhaustion. The scent of lavender, faint and clean, now clung to his pillows. For the first time in years, the silence of his home was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, steady breathing of another person, and the loneliness he had long mistaken for peace felt, suddenly, like a hollow ache in his chest. The blizzard raged for 2 days. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling wall of white. Inside, a quiet rhythm established itself. Silas rose before dawn, moving with a practiced hush so as not to wake her. He would tend the fire, make coffee, and then go out to the barn to care for the animals, returning with the sting of cold on his skin and a dusting of white on his shoulders. Elara would be awake when he came back, the bed made with military precision, her few belongings neatly placed on the small trunk at its foot. She did not speak much, but she watched everything. She watched the way he mended a piece of tack, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. She watched the way he moved, a quiet economy to his actions that wasted nothing. On the first morning, she had taken the broom from its hook and swept the floor while he was outside. When he returned, he saw the neat piles of dust gone, the floorboards clean. He said nothing, but he left a pail of fresh water for her by the basin. It was a silent negotiation of shared space. He ceded the care of the interior to her without a word, and she accepted it. That afternoon, she found a basket of his mending a shirt with a torn cuff, socks worn thin at the heel. She sat in the chair by the fire, the light catching the deep auburn of her hair, and began to sew. Her stitches were small, and even a line of perfect, disciplined marks against the rough-spun cloth. Silas sat at the table, sharpening his knives, the scrape of stone on steel, a steady counterpoint to the whisper of her needle. He found himself watching her hands. They were not soft, but they were elegant. He wondered what they had done before they had come to be here, mending a stranger's shirt in a blizzard. Later, as dusk began to fall, he saw her retrieve her reticule. From it, she took the small, bone-handled knife he had told her to keep close. She used it to slice an apple he'd brought in from the root cellar, offering him half on the flat of the blade. He took it. Their fingers did not touch. He then held out his hand, palm up, a silent request. She hesitated, then placed the knife in his hand, handle first. It was a gesture of trust so profound it struck him silent. He took the small weapon, ran his thumb over the edge, and then walked to his whetstone. He spent 10 minutes honing the blade to a razor sharpness before wiping it clean and handing it back to her. Again, hilt first. She took it, her eyes locked on his. "Thank you. A tool should be kept right," he said, his voice low. It was all he could manage. That single exchange shifted the air in the cabin. The tension did not disappear, but it changed. It was no longer the wariness of strangers, but the heightened awareness of a man and a woman occupying the same small, intimate space. The walls seemed to draw closer, the firelight softer. The silence was now filled with unspoken things, with the rustle of her dress and the quiet weight of his presence. He was acutely aware of her, of the way a stray piece of hair curled at her temple, of the scent of the soap she used, of the steady rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. He had lived his entire adult life in a state of controlled solitude. Now, a woman with quiet hands and watchful eyes was methodically, silently, dismantling it one stitch at a time. On the third night, a scream tore through the cabin's quiet. It was a raw, terrified sound that snapped Silas from a light sleep. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept propped by the hearth before he was fully awake. But the threat wasn't outside. It was in his bed. Elara was thrashing, tangled in the furs, her hands flung up as if to ward off a blow. Her eyes were closed, but she whimpered small, broken sounds of no. "Please." He stopped, his bare feet cold on the floorboards, the rifle feeling useless in his hand. This was not a danger he could fight. This was a ghost, a memory that had followed her into his home. He leaned the rifle back against the stone and moved closer, stopping a few feet from the bed. He didn't know what to do. His instincts were for action, for shielding, for fighting. But this required a different kind of strength, a gentleness he wasn't sure he possessed. He could wake her, but that felt like a violation, like pulling her from one hell, only to throw her into the confusion of another. So he did the only thing he could think of. He pulled the chair from the table and set it near the bed, but not beside it. He sat down, a silent, steady sentinel in the dark. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He just sat, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her dream. He watched as, slowly, the thrashing subsided. Her breathing, ragged and harsh, began to even out. The frantic whimpers faded into a low murmur, and then silence. She did not wake. But she grew still, as if some part of her subconscious knew she was no longer alone in her terror. He stayed there for over an hour, until the deep, even rhythm of her sleep returned. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light on her face. In the soft glow, the proud, guarded lines of her waking expression were gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made his chest tighten. He saw the faint shadow of a bruise, old and faded, high on her cheekbone, almost hidden by her hairline. He had not noticed it before. A cold, quiet anger settled deep in his gut. It was an anger directed at the faceless ghost in her dream, at whatever man had put that look of fear in her eyes and that mark on her skin. He finally rose, his joints stiff from the cold, and added a log to the fire. As he turned back, her eyes were open. She was watching him, her gaze clear and lucid in the firelight. There was no fear in them now, only a profound, searching quiet. "You stayed?" she whispered. Her voice was husky with sleep. "I'm here," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He expected her to look away, to retreat behind her walls of pride. Instead, she held his gaze. "Silas," she said, and the way she spoke his name was different. It wasn't a label. It was a recognition. It was the first time she had said it when not in direct reply to him. The sound of it in the quiet room felt more intimate than any touch. He gave a single slow nod, then retreated to his bedroll on the floor, turning his back to give her privacy. But he did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of her breathing, the echo of her voice saying his name lingering in the dark. A wall inside him had been breached. He had let a stranger into his home to shelter her from a storm, but it was he who felt undone. The morning of the fourth day, the wind died. A profound silence fell over the land, and when Silas opened the door, the world was a pristine, blinding expanse of white under a sharp blue sky. The blizzard had passed. "Road to town will be clear by tomorrow," he said, his voice loud in the sudden stillness. Elara stood behind him in the doorway, wrapping her shawl tighter. The crisp, clean air was a shock after days inside. She looked out at the unbroken snow, her expression unreadable. The forced intimacy of the storm was over. A new uncertainty settled between them. The trip to town was a necessity. They were low on flour and coffee, and she needed to send a telegram to find a way to move on. They rode together on his gelding, the deep snow making the track impassable for a buggy. This time, she did not feel like a stranger. Her hands rested lightly on his waist for balance, and the warmth of her seeped through his thick coat. It was a distraction he fought to ignore, focusing on the path ahead, on the way the sun glinted off the snow-covered pines. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street in the summer, now a packed-down thoroughfare of mud and ice. It was a place of watchful eyes and quiet judgments. As they rode in, heads turned. A man like Silas, who kept to himself, arriving with a woman no one had ever seen. It was an event. He felt the stares like physical pressure on his back. Elara felt them too. She sat straighter, her chin held high, but Silas could feel the tension in her hands. He dismounted in front of the general store and turned to help her down. For a moment, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. As his hands circled her waist, a man stepped out of the saloon across the street. He was tall and dressed in a fine wool coat that stood out against the rough clothing of the other townsfolk. His face was handsome, but his smile didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Well now, Silas," the man said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I didn't realize you'd taken to rescuing strays." The man was Jedediah Finch, who owned the biggest ranch in the valley and acted as if he owned the town along with it. Silas ignored him, his focus entirely on Elara, making sure her feet were steady on the icy ground before he released her. He gave her a look that said, "Pay him no mind." But Finch was not a man to be ignored. He strode across the street, his polished boots sinking slightly into the slush. He tipped his hat to Elara, but his eyes roamed over her in a way that was both appreciative and proprietary. "Jedediah Finch," he said, his smile widening. "And you are?" Elara's back was ramrod straight. "A traveler," she said, her voice cool and distant. "And this is my business." Finch's gaze flickered to Silas, a hint of a sneer on his lips. "Everything in this valley is my business, miss. Especially when a beautiful woman appears on the arm of a man who barely speaks 2 words a year." He turned his full attention back to Elara. "If you're in need of assistance, you'll find my hospitality far more comfortable than a hermit's cabin." The offer was slick, a veneer of charm over a core of possessiveness. Elara saw it instantly. She had seen it 100 times before in 100 other men. It was the reason she was here, alone, with a broken wagon and a past she was trying to outrun. She gave a small, chillingly polite smile. "Mr. Silas has been a perfect gentleman. I require no other assistance." She then turned and walked into the general store, leaving the 2 men alone in the street. Finch's smile vanished. He looked at Silas, his eyes narrowed. "You be careful, Silas. Some things are too fine for a man like you to handle. They break easy." Silas met his gaze, his own expression flat and hard as granite. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a wall Finch could not breach. He simply turned and followed Elara into the store, the unspoken challenge hanging in the frozen air between them. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Elara stood by the counter, ostensibly examining a bolt of calico, but her hands were clenched, her knuckles white. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman whose gossip network was more efficient than the telegraph, was watching them both with undisguised curiosity. Silas moved through the store, gathering supplies with his usual quiet efficiency: flour, salt, coffee, bacon. He added a small bag of lemon drops to the pile without thinking, remembering the way she sometimes pressed her lips together as if tasting something sour. He set the goods on the counter. Mrs. Gable tallied the cost, her eyes darting between them. "Heard you had a visitor during the storm," she said, her voice laced with insinuation. "Wagon broke," Silas said, his tone discouraging further questions. Elara walked to the counter. "I need to send a telegram." "Wires down from the blizzard," Mrs. Gable said with a hint of satisfaction. "Might be a week or more before it's fixed." Elara's face fell, a flicker of despair she quickly masked. Silas saw it. He saw the sudden, crushing weight of her predicament. She was trapped, not just by the snow, but by circumstance. He paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate. He picked up the sacks, then paused, looking at Elara. "We should go." Outside, the winter sun was starting to sink, turning the snow to a pale, bruised purple. The street was emptier now, but the sense of being watched remained. Finch was gone, but his presence lingered. The ride back to the homestead was silent. The easy quiet of the cabin was gone, replaced by the tension from town. Silas could feel her despair, a cold, heavy thing that sat between them on the horse. He knew what people were saying, what a man like Finch was thinking, that he was taking advantage of her, that she was his captive, or his whore. The thought made his hands tighten on the reins. He had offered her shelter, and in doing so, had inadvertently put her in a new kind of cage. Back in the cabin, the warmth felt different. It was no longer a cozy sanctuary, but a small, confining space. Elara moved to the window, staring out at the vast, empty landscape. She looked small and terribly alone. He unpacked the supplies, setting the small bag of lemon drops on the table. She didn't seem to notice. He watched her for a long moment, the straightness of her back, the proud tilt of her head. He knew she would not ask for help. Her pride was her armor, the only thing she had left. He went to his workbench in the corner, where he kept his tools. He picked up a small wooden box he had been carving during the long winter nights, a project with no purpose, just something to keep his hands busy. Now it had a purpose. He worked for an hour, sanding the wood smooth, fitting a tiny hinge. Elara eventually turned from the window and began to prepare a simple supper. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. When he was finished, he walked to the table and set the small polished box in front of her. It was plain, made of pine, but the grain was beautiful, and it was crafted with painstaking care. She looked at it, then up at him, her expression questioning. "For your things," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her reticule. "So they're safe." It was a clumsy offering, but she understood. She slowly reached out and ran a finger over the smooth lid. It wasn't just a box. It was a recognition of her life, of the small things she carried with her. It was a promise of safety, made of wood and care. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight. She looked from the box to his face, and for the first time he saw the full depth of her exhaustion and her fear, and beneath it, a flicker of something else. Gratitude, hope. It was more than he could bear. He turned away, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The next few days were taut with unspoken things. The failed trip to town had changed their dynamic. They were no longer just two people sheltering from a storm. They were a man and a woman in a compromised situation, with the eyes of the world, or at least the small world of redemption, upon them. Elara was quieter than ever, her pride warring with the stark reality of her dependence. Silas found himself watching her constantly, trying to read the thoughts behind her guarded expression. He felt a fierce, protective anger toward Finch and the town gossips, but also a frustrating sense of helplessness. He could give her a roof and food, but he could not give her back her autonomy. One evening, as she was washing the supper dishes, he saw her pause and press a hand to her temple. The strain of the last weeks was showing. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a pallor to her skin that hadn't been there before. He felt a surge of guilt. This life, this harsh, isolated existence, was his choice. It wasn't hers. He walked to the fire, staring into the flames. "Finch is a man who takes what he wants," he said, the words coming out low and rough. "He didn't look at her. He sees you. He thinks he can have you." Elara finished the dishes, her movements precise and deliberate. She dried her hands and came to stand on the other side of the hearth. "I am not something to be had." "He won't see it that way," Silas said. "A woman alone, it's a weakness to men like him. He'll offer you marriage, a fine house, protection." He finally turned to look at her, his face grim in the firelight. "You deserve better than him." The words hung in the air between them. He had meant them as a warning, as a statement of fact. But Elara heard something else. She heard the space he left empty, the alternative he didn't offer. Her eyes, which had been downcast, lifted to meet his. They were clear and sharp, cutting through his own guarded defenses. "Then be better," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an undeniable challenge. "Don't tell me what I deserve from a man I don't want. Show me what you can offer instead." Silas was stunned into silence. He had spent his life in action, not words. He knew how to build a fence, track a deer, survive a blizzard. He did not know how to answer a challenge like that. He saw himself through her eyes. A quiet, withdrawn man in a one-room cabin, with nothing to offer but a rough-hewn existence. What was that compared to Finch's wealth and influence? But her gaze did not waver. It was not a demand for riches or promises. It was a demand for courage. The courage to step out from behind his wall of silence. To stop being a passive protector and become an active choice. The air crackled. He had seen her as a survivor, someone to be sheltered. But in that moment, she was the strong one, and he was the coward, hiding behind his stoic facade. Her words echoed in the quiet room. "Then be better." It was the most terrifying and the most hopeful thing anyone had ever said to him. He had no answer for her. Not yet. He simply stood there, stripped bare by her perception, a new and unfamiliar yearning taking root in the barren soil of his heart. The sound of hoofbeats a few days later was an unwelcome intrusion. Silas was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a balm to his unquiet mind. He looked up to see Jedediah Finch riding up the track, leading a fine-looking Mare with a side saddle. Silas rested his axe, his posture becoming utterly still. He was a rock, an immovable part of the landscape. Finch dismounted with a flourish, his smile as polished and insincere as his boots. "Silas, just checking on our stranded traveler?" His gaze went past Silas to the cabin door, where Elara had appeared, drawn by the sound. Her face was a polite, impenetrable mask. Finch's smile broadened as he looked at her. "Miss Elara, I was concerned for your welfare. This is no place for a lady of your quality." He gestured to the Mare. "I've brought you a proper mount. My home is at your disposal until the telegraph is repaired, and you can make your arrangements." It was a masterful move. Public, generous, and deeply coercive. To refuse would make her seem ungrateful, and him, Silas, possessive and cruel. Elara stepped forward, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from a clean flour sack. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Finch, but I am quite comfortable here." Finch's eyes hardened slightly. "Comfortable? In a one-room shack with a man who barely knows your name? Come now, let's not play games. A woman like you needs a protector. Silas here is a good man with an axe, but he can't give you a name, a position. I can." He was speaking to her, but his words were a clear challenge to Silas. He was laying out the world's grim logic. A woman as worth was her husband as status. Elara's chin lifted. "My name is my own, Mr. Finch. I am not in the market for a new one." The rejection, though polite, was absolute. Finch's facade of charm finally cracked. He took a step toward her, his movements suddenly aggressive. "You misunderstand. This isn't a courtship. It's a reality. You have no people, no funds. You're living in a man's home, under his roof. What do you think people are saying? I am offering you a way to salvage your reputation. You should be grateful." Silas moved then. He didn't run. He simply placed himself between Finch and Elara. He was not touching either of them, but his presence was a physical barrier. He was taller than Finch, broader, and in that moment he seemed to be made of the same unyielding timber as the trees around them. "She said no," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And you think you have a say in this? This land you're squatting on, it's mortgaged to the bank in town. A bank I happen to own a controlling interest in. One word from me, and you'll be out on your ear before the spring thaw, with nothing but that axe to your name." The threat was bald, brutal. "Lose your land, or give me the woman." Silas didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on Finch, cold and steady. "Get off my land." For a moment, it seemed Finch might push the issue. But something in Silas's stillness, in the absolute certainty in his voice, gave him pause. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, and would therefore lose nothing. Finch sneered. "Have it your way. But when you're both starving, remember my offer." He swung himself back onto his horse, tugging the Mare's lead. He tipped his hat to Elara with mocking courtesy. "Miss Elara, I'll see you in town." He rode off, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Elara stared at Silas's back, at the rigid line of his shoulders. He had placed himself in front of her. He had faced down a threat to his very existence for her. He hadn't said a word of affection, hadn't made a single promise. He had simply stood. It was more than any man had ever done for her. The confrontation with Finch shattered the fragile peace of the homestead. The threat against Silas's land hung in the air, a poison that seeped into their quiet routines. Elara saw a new tension in him. He still performed his daily chores with the same steady competence, but there was a tightness around his eyes, A grin set to his jaw. He was worried. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. He believed Finch's threat had put her in even greater danger, leaving her with no options at all. She felt a desperate need to make him understand that she was not a burden to be protected, but a partner to stand with. That evening, they sat at the table, a half-eaten meal between them. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, Elara put down her fork. "He cannot force you to sell." Silas looked up from his plate, his gaze distant. "Finch owns the bank. He can call the note. I don't have the cash to pay it off." "Then we will find it," she said, her voice firm. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "We? I am not a china doll, Silas. I am not something you won and now must pay for. This is my fight, too. He threatened you because of me." He shook his head, a gesture of deep, ingrained self-deprecation. "This is my problem. I should have sent you away. Sent you to the preacher's wife in town. And let Finch corner me there? You gave me sanctuary, not a prison. There is a difference." Her passionate defense of him seemed to break through his reserve. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just the stoic protector, but the lonely man beneath. The man who felt he had nothing to offer. The man who believed her when she said she deserved better and thought he wasn't it. The next day, they rode to redemption. It was a calculated risk. They needed to know the truth of Finch's threat, and they needed to face the town together. As they rode down the main street, the silence was deafening. Windows twitched. People stopped to stare. They were a scandal, a story, a judgment waiting to be passed. They went first to the bank. The clerk, a nervous man who answered to Finch, confirmed it. The note on Silas's land was due, and the bank was calling it. They had 30 days. Leaving the bank, the weight of the verdict settled on them. They were standing on the boardwalk when Finch emerged from the saloon, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Several other ranchers were with him, men who depended on his goodwill. "Well, well," Finch said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Looks like our happy couple has received some bad news. Don't worry, Elara. My offer still stands. Marry me, and I'll see to it your man here gets to keep his little patch of dirt." Elara went cold. It was a public humiliation, a stripping of her agency, turning her into a piece of property to be bartered. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how the quiet homesteader and his mysterious woman would react. Silas did not look at Finch. He looked at Elara. His face was calm, his eyes holding hers. He was not asking her what to do. He was waiting for her to make her own choice, showing the entire town that her voice and her will were her own. Elara took a breath, drawing on every ounce of her resilience. She turned her gaze from Silas to Finch, her expression clear and cold as ice. "I would rather live in a tent with an honorable man than in a mansion with you." Then she did something that sealed their fate. She stepped closer to Silas and deliberately, publicly, slid her hand into his. His hand was rough, calloused, but it closed around hers with a warmth and strength that felt like coming home. Silas's gaze shifted to Finch, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried with absolute finality. "She has made her choice." He looked down at their joined hands. "And I have made mine." He turned, still holding her hand, and led her away, leaving Finch standing alone in the middle of the street, his public ploy in ruins. They had chosen each other, openly, clearly, and now they would face the consequences together. The ride back to the cabin was a silent testament to the gravity of their public declaration. His hand, which had held her so firmly in town, now rested on the saddle horn, but the memory of its warmth lingered. The world had shrunk to the two of them against the vast, unforgiving landscape. They had 30 days. Inside the cabin, the familiar space felt charged with a new, fragile intimacy. The choice made in the street had to be reconciled here, in the quiet of their shared home. Elara took off her shawl and hung it on its peg. Silas built up the fire, the familiar task a grounding ritual. The unspoken questions hung between them. What now? What are we? He turned from the hearth, his face cast in the warm, flickering light. The harsh lines seemed softer, the guardedness in his eyes replaced by a deep, searching vulnerability. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, without the filter of his own perceived inadequacies. "I have nothing," he said, his voice raw. "A mortgaged piece of land. A one-room cabin. It's not a life for you." She walked toward him until only a few feet separated them. The lamplight caught the earnestness in her face, the unwavering strength that he was only now beginning to understand was her core. "You have your honor," she said softly. "You have your strength. You stood for me when it would have been easier to stand aside. You have built a life here with your own two hands. Do not tell me that is nothing." She took a step closer. "I have been in fine houses, Silas. They were cold places, full of things, but empty of kindness. I am not looking for a house. I am looking for a home." His throat was tight. Her words were a gift, a balm on a wound he hadn't known he carried. He had spent so long believing his solitude was a failing, his simple life a mark of his worthlessness. She saw it as a strength. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the space between them. It was a silent question. "May I?" She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her consent freely given. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw with a tenderness that belied the roughness of his skin. Her skin was soft, warm. He felt the flutter of her pulse beneath his thumb. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. A quiet surrender that was also an act of immense trust. "Elara," he whispered, the name a vow. He drew her closer, his other arm circling her waist, gathering her to him. It was not a gesture of possession, but of reverence. She rested her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. He lowered his head, and his kiss was gentle, tentative at first, a question. She answered by rising on her toes, her arms sliding around his neck, returning the kiss with a yearning that matched his own. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching recognition. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke, of solitude and sanctuary, of two lonely souls finally finding their harbor. He lifted her into his arms and carried her the few steps to the bed. He laid her down gently on the furs, and the look in his eyes as he followed her down was one of pure, unvarnished devotion. The world outside, with its threats and its deadlines, faded away. There was only the warmth of the fire, the hush of the cabin, and the quiet, sacred promise of the night. In the gray light of dawn, Silas woke first. Elara was asleep beside him, her head pillowed on his arm, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm against his chest. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. The fears of the previous day, the bank, the land, Finch seemed distant, unreal. All that felt real was the woman in his arms, the weight of her, a solid, comforting anchor. He lay still, not wanting to wake her, and watched the slow dawn fill the room. He had lived in this cabin for 5 years, but it had never felt like this. It had never felt full. The space was no longer defined by his solitude, but by her presence. Her scent lingered on the pillows. Her mending basket sat by the hearth. The small wooden box he made her rested on the trunk, at the foot of the bed. They were small things, but they had transformed the space from a shelter into a home. When she stirred, her eyes fluttered open and met his. There was no awkwardness, no regret, just a soft, sleepy smile that made his heart ache. She traced the line of his collarbone with one finger. "Good morning," she whispered. "Morning," he rumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his touch infinitely gentle. There were no grand declarations, There didn't need to be. The vow had been made in the quiet of the night. Now was the time for aftercare, for the small, tender acts that solidified their bond. He rose and built up the fire, then put the coffee on to boil. While it brewed, he brought a basin of warm water to the bedside with a clean cloth. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently washed her face, his movements careful and reverent. She watched him, her eyes soft, accepting the simple, intimate service without a word. It was a baptism of sorts, washing away the shadows of the past and anointing the beginning of their new life. They had a problem to solve, a future to fight for, but in that moment, there was only a profound sense of peace. For the next few weeks, they worked as a team. Elara took over his sparse account books, her neat handwriting filling the pages, looking for any way to save money, any asset that could be sold. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, cutting and hauling timber to sell in town, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion. They were fighting for their home. But the work was not a burden. It was a shared purpose. Their evenings were spent in quiet companionship. He would rub the ache from her shoulders as she bent over the ledgers. She would stitch a tear in his coat while he planned the next day's work. They talked more now, not about the past, but about the future. About the garden she wanted to plant come spring, about the second room he would add to the cabin. They were building a life in words, even as they fought to keep the foundation it stood on. One evening she brought him his rifle, which he had been neglecting. She had cleaned and oiled it to perfection. She handed it to him, her expression serious. "A tool should be kept right," she said, echoing his own words back to him. He took the rifle, but his eyes were on her. He saw not the resilient survivor he had first met, but a strong, capable partner who stood shoulder to shoulder with him. He leaned the rifle against the wall and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him, a truth he hadn't known how to speak until now. She held him tight, her answer a fierce whisper against his chest. "And I love you." They still had a mountain to climb, but now they would climb it together.